Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Newsroom. I'm your host, Khalid. But today is Wednesday, the 12th of January 2022. These are the stories that will be under discussion during the course of the show. We'll begin, ladies and gentlemen, by the pledge by the United Nations that says that it needs $5 billion in aid for Afghanistan to avert a humanitarian catastrophe and after the ravished country, after the future it has had for around 40 years of suffering. This is a very important pledge, and it shows the importance that the United Nations is putting as far as averting the crisis that is currently engulfing Afghanistan is concerned. Our Prime Minister Imran Khan Sahab has also talked about this very pledge and has said that Pakistan has been talking about it since quite some time. Let's hope this really comes in the right hands before it is too late. Also, the US has pledged around a couple of $100 million, $308 million in humanitarian aid as well. So, of course, this adds to that as well. This is our first segment, ladies and gentlemen. Our second segment concerns Iranian foreign policy in the wake of the JCPOA, the 8th round of which is happening in Vienna as we speak. The Iranian foreign minister is, of course, traveling to different brotherly countries in order to apprise them of Iran's point of view and, of course, make them understand what Iran wants out of this JCPOA. How important is this JCPOA for Iran, for the P5+1? This is going to be our second story. Then we'll be talking about the Parks and Horticulture Authority, otherwise known as the PHA in Rawalpindi, that has developed a mega rainwater harvesting storage project in 5 major parks around Rawalpindi city. We know that it rains a lot in certain months of the year, but if this rainwater is properly conserved, it can be used not only for watering the plants and trees, but also for the water harvesting of the different parks, and it will not only help these parks, but it will also conserve that water that we would have used otherwise or not used. This is going to be our third story. Our fourth story comes from the state of New Jersey in the United States that have passed a resolution on Tuesday that has condemned the Sikh massacre, terming it a genocide. Of course, this is an old Sikh massacre that happened in the 1980s, and this is what led to a huge outcry and a huge division amongst the different minorities of India, and it was high time that a country such as the US, and even if it's New Jersey, understands the whole massacre in its right perspective and also terms it as a genocide. And our last story is going to be about Khalid from Tando, Allahyar, Sindh. He's a young rapper, and we're going to leave you with his song. Rap is everywhere, so it is in the interior of Sindh as well. Let's begin with our first story, ladies and gentlemen, and this first story concerns the United Nations and its pledge, the latest pledge. It has asked the countries across the world to give $5 billion in aid in order to avert a humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan. We know that there is a humanitarian crisis, there's an economic crisis, there is no money, there might be food, but there is even no money for the people in Afghanistan. So it is extremely important that the right food, the right aid, money, and the other necessities of life reach the Afghan people before it is extremely late and before we are subject to another form of huge amounts of deaths in Afghanistan due to this crisis. To talk about this crisis, this pledge, this aid that has also been appreciated by our Prime Minister Imran Khan, we've been joined by Dr. Salma Malik in the studio. She's a foreign affairs expert. Dr. Saiba, thank you very much to have joined us.
Thank you.
Dr. Saiba, $5 billion in aid for Afghanistan, is it enough?
For the moment, I think even a small morsel is enough for Afghanistan for 2 reasons. Number one, that the international community is finally realizing the very oft-repeated stuff that we had been saying all along since the fall of Kabul, that there is an immense need for the international community to engage on the humanitarian front to help out the Afghans. And they were thinking that we are doing it to appease the Taliban and so many other things, the political connotation that comes with the aid scenario. But having said that, now that the international community has realized this could be a starter, plus the fact that besides the UN, there's also the US that had promised millions of aid, 308 initially. In October also they had made some pledges. Yet the very fact is that it may or may not be enough, but what we need to also see is that as this crisis becomes deeper and deeper, how much requirement would there be in real term, and how much of that money would actually filter down to the Afghan nationals 100%, because there is a very strong distrust in the Taliban regime, which is understandable. So if it is coming through development agencies and aid agencies, we very well know what happened in the 20 years and how those aid agencies and the contractors
How can we control
worked.
those aid agencies and ensure that the money or the aid or the food reaches the Afghan people in the right time and really reaches them in letter and spirit?
Well, you see, that's actually a very difficult question, because I think this is kind of a part of a contract that when you are giving out this money to the aid agencies, a certain percentage definitely goes back. So that is a given thing. But the very fact is that for people who are virtually begging out in the streets in this cold that we see, the weather that has come up in Afghanistan and all, even the little is there, or plus the recognition that there is a problem. But increased transparency, audit, and the very fact that reports such as Cigar and others that were coming during the US engagement were kind of a whistleblowers. So if there is an adequate parallel accountability, transparency, and a very good audit that goes with it, I think things should work out. But one thing I would like to add here is that had this money, which we genuinely know may not be enough, because it's not only targeting Afghan nationals residing in Afghanistan at the moment, it's also looking at the refugees or the displaced people worldwide, anywhere that the Afghans are going, and their need is also of a different nature. But the other worry is that, God forbid, if this aid money does not come through, then the illicit economy that has been very strong in Afghanistan will again deepen its tentacles. So that also needs to be prevented.
Now, the United Nations chief says that we need to work very quickly, diligently, before the people in Afghanistan die of hunger, of starvation, and of disease. Now, we know also that the US is donating a lot of COVAX vaccines to Afghanistan as well. But as you again said, the role of the intermediaries becomes even more important, because the money or the shelter or the aid is not going directly to the Afghan government, because there is no recognition of the Afghan government as such by the West. Now, in this whole scenario, when of course the US is asking for this money, and it might take some time for them to gather the money, the US is giving money, other countries are also pledging. Pakistan has been helping Afghanistan as well. What would be the order of things that need to happen for Afghanistan to kind of come out of this current crisis in your point of view?
I think the immediate problem for the moment, if we look, given the weather and all, is A, provision of food, B, provision of healthcare at most immediate basis. And then of course some per diems or daily stipends that go with it. But I think the worst case scenario at the moment is that people are stripped of any cash. They have nothing to purchase things from. There is no food in the market. People have already...
No, but you know, there was a report by the BBC, Dr. Sahiba, in which they say there are a couple of food items in the market, but the people do not have the money to buy those items.
Absolutely. And that's the next point to it, that even if you have stuff in the market, there is nothing. And of course, people are bartering and all. And the biggest problem here is that there is no governance formula, even with the Taliban administration regime, whatever we would like to call them. So say the aid workers come in, whom are they going to engage with? I mean, at times we jokingly talk about it that other countries, the Asian neighbors, they were very smart that whenever they entered Afghanistan, even during the Ghani government, they would have an agreement with the government, but they would also go and talk to at that time, the local Taliban militia leader for permits to mine and all of that stuff. So that made things pretty legitimate and for them to smoothly tread the ground. But here, if you are saying that, okay, we are going to help the Afghan people, but we are not going to talk to the Taliban, that is going to create a lot of problems. The Taliban are not going to create problems for these people, given the fact that a lot of their work would be relieved of them. The fact that they have a lot of pressure to feed people, to shelter people, to provide them health care would be taken care of. However, having said that, there would be crossing of paths somewhere, there would be a conflict of interest. So how do you address that? There has to be a proper roadmap to do that. And unless and until these people talk to the Taliban as well, things are not going to work that smoothly. Plus, of course, Taliban would have their own mood swings and sentiments about with what type of people should come here and what not.
Well, speaking of that, and speaking of the fact that the US has certain, apprehensions about the Afghan Taliban, why doesn't the Afghan Taliban government, in your point of view, address those preconditions that have been put forward by the West in order for, this money to kind of start flowing directly and in the right circles?
Actually, this is ironic. I mean, here the US freezes their money and then the US pledges a lot of money to help the Afghan nationals. So there's a dichotomy here. So let alone, just give them the money and see how it works. If they don't perform, then one can sanction them to no end. Afghanistan has already been sanctioned a lot. But the problem here is that the Afghans lack the capacity, the US also lacks the capacity as to how to connect with one another. And there's this loss of face and a lot of those aspects that are working here. But would the Taliban really have the capacity to address the concerns that you are talking about? I think that they don't. Staying in Doha, having a conversation in Doha, having a roadmap to taking the power once the Americans leave is all good. But actually running a country which is seen a minimum of 40 years of turmoil is a very, very different ballgame altogether. And just yesterday we were having this conversation with some young journalists who had been to Kabul and all, and they said they are willing to talk to you. However, they have their own language, the Taliban, and you have to go by their language. And Americans are not willing to. The Americans have also always had this mindset that they're very superior and they're not going to talk down to the Taliban, or the Taliban will be allowed to talk down. Is it
more or less a colonial mindset in your point of view?
Absolutely, absolutely. Yet they need to realize that they are the ones who have left the Afghans in a major lurch. So I think there is this aspect of a pressure or a humanitarian pressure on them, or this moral pressure that the Americans feel that they really have to work with the Afghans to help them out of this crisis, or from the humanitarian crisis becoming any more intense, because many Afghans are appealing to the Western capitals that you need to help us out and you need to bail us out. And they actually want to prevent that aspect as well.
Now, as you yourself said, around 160 NGOs, US agencies are going to help deliver that aid that has been pledged by the United Nations from all the countries of the world. Some, of course, will be used to pay the frontline workers. Some would be used to pay the healthcare staff as well. But at the end of the day, how long do you feel, Dr. Sahiba, is it going to take for a portion of that aid to reach the people?
Ideally, it should reach as of yesterday, but it entirely depends. Is this just a wish list, or is it something that they have already worked out upon? If it is something that they have worked out the modalities, it can happen within a couple of weeks. But I think even weeks is a very late scenario.
Do we have a couple of weeks,
Afghanistan is suffering. Afghanistan is suffering big time. Pakistan had actually told the international capitals that come winters, Afghanistan is going to be in a dire situation, and the indicators are showing as to how many people can starve to death, how many people can die of the cold, and so many other things. So I think
we had in the OIC special extraordinary summit of the Council of Foreign Ministers just on the agenda of Afghanistan.
But there's a lot of bureaucracy, even when it comes to the development aid and all of that stuff, or humanitarian aid. There is a lot of bureaucracy that runs it. But I think if the UN starts working its machinery, many of the things that the UN had there are not totally dismantled. They just need to put different preconditionalities aside and just go for helping people unconditionally, and not having these preconditions that women teachers should be in office. That can happen once people are alive enough to perform.
Exactly, it's stable enough so as to go and undergo other decisions that have been taken beforehand by the West. Nevertheless, the US is also going to go through the US aid. Do you feel also that the role of the US aid in the months to come is also going to be important, because not only is the fact that the US is an important player by itself, but also part of the United Nations?
Absolutely, but also, Omar, you need to see this thing that between August to now, the US was clearly missing from the Afghan scene. And now they've suddenly realized that there's this huge gap in deficit that we have, and we are leaving this area open for Chinese or the Russians or other powers to come. So part of that US aid is, in fact, I won't say part of that, I would say most of the US aid that is coming to Afghanistan, where it is also moral pressure, is majorly because of the political reasons that the US wants to establish its footprints there, re-establish its footprints, and it really wants
to. But Dr.
Salma,
there lies a dichotomy. How can you re-establish a presence in Afghanistan when you have just left it?
That's the funniest point. I mean, that's precisely what I'm saying. You freeze their accounts and then you give them the money from another quarter, calling humanitarian aid. So they don't want to lose face, and they also want to come across as a country that does not want to recognize the Taliban, but it wants to help the Afghan nationals. And I think, unfortunately, the US hasn't really learned much of the lessons, because that's precisely what they have done in the past, and that's precisely what they're doing. But I think they are also trying to prevent another 9/11 from happening, from the state of Afghanistan, that it need not collapse totally, that it would give rise to so many elements. But one thing that I feel is that by ensuring this aid lifeline to the Afghan nationals, which is a parallel grid to working with the government or whatever sitting regime in Afghanistan is, because it's still not a recognized regime, and the Taliban are doing nothing to infuse confidence in the international community that they may allow some future elections or whatever, but that's their concern. But the fact is that I'm pretty sure there are elements that are also looking at the traditional security aspect of how to get rid of the Taliban and bring together a government of their choice, sometime, somewhere.
So this is more or less a political game that is being played?
To a very larger extent.
All right. Then where does that leave, for example, the possible scenarios in case the aid doesn't happen to reach the Afghans in time? There is the whole crisis of illegal immigration, then there is terrorism, then there's the drug cartels and the drug culture that used to be prominently visible in Afghanistan. Aren't these three things going to rise again?
They are going to be an immediate problem for next door neighbors, mainly Pakistan, Central Asia, even China. I mean, in fact, they would be very happy if China finds roadblocks in Afghanistan in the face of illegal economy or several other things that you have just mentioned. But the very fact is that Chinese have been very prudent in how they have approached these issues, and they don't really find those aspects as a roadblock, because they have managed a mechanism through which they work around these things or whatever. But the fact is that in these 20 years post 9/11, the illicit economy, the drugs, the guns, all of those things were very much rampant, as one is thinking of now. But in case there's a complete state failure or disaster in Afghanistan, then of course it is going to totally mushroom out of the country, and it's going to be a major problem for Iran, for Pakistan, for Central Asian countries. And not only this, in fact, it is going to impact the entire region and regions beyond. So I think the US just wants to keep this thing localized to an extent that it does not really, the heat does not reach Washington or New York.
But the heat can reach any other country in the region. That's
not their concern. So, so long as, and of course, Pakistan for the moment is the bad boy, so they need to be taught a lesson. So they'd better have a taste of their own medicine.
Now, finally, Dr. Syed, speaking of Pakistan, how important becomes our country's role in this current crisis that is engulfing or has engulfed Afghanistan, and the aid that will reach at some time? When it will reach, this is a whole question mark as well. Pakistan has been sending aid. We know that the aid has been pledged by Shah Mahmood Qureshi Sahab as well in the past. But how important do you feel now becomes Pakistan's role, A, to avert this disaster, B, to also avert trickling of terrorist elements or such elements that could create a destabilized country?
Number one, of course, Pakistan's physical action of fencing the border is very important. And I think we should continue doing that. We need to talk to the Taliban, and we need to hammer this point home that it's very important for our country's traditional security needs. The political gimmickry that Afghans, I'm saying Afghans, not Taliban, but Afghans in totality, which includes the Taliban and the non-Taliban political forces, of calling the international border as a Durand line, has long since run its course. So Pakistan really needs to protect itself. If that may protect non-state elements from crossing over into Pakistan, that is a small relief for us. But the fact is that this would happen. The second thing is, in case the aid does not reach in time, there's going to be a very natural outflow of Afghan nationals for security, for safety, for protection into Pakistan. And despite our not being signatory to International Refugee Convention, etc., Pakistan would be humanitarianly bound to cushion all of that flight of individuals here. You have seen that once the US left Afghanistan, Pakistan was doing all the operations on behalf of the US in that regard. So when the aid comes, I think Pakistan is again going to be very, very fundamental and important as to the aid might be centered in Pakistan and going from Pakistan to Afghanistan.
So the role of Pakistan remains and will continue to remain important in the days,
months. Although the OIC also
ago.
said that our contact person is going to, in Kabul, is going to work. But of course, all of them are operating via Pakistan. So Pakistan cannot be ignored, and we have to brace up for that.
Let's hope that the West understands these 2 points, that Pakistan A cannot be ignored, that it's not the bad boy as a lot of countries in the West seem to think, and secondly that the aid needs to trickle down to the Afghan people, as you said, yesterday, not even today.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much, Dr. Salma. Malik, a foreign affairs expert, who have joined us, who have talked to us about the aid that has been pledged by the United Nations of $5 billion US. Let's hope that money reaches quicker than we anticipate, and also the US that has pledged more aid. Thank you very much, Dr. Salma.
Thank you so much for calling me.
Let's come to our second story, ladies and gentlemen. That concerns Iran's foreign relations, the whole perspective of the JCPOA. Now, the Iranian foreign minister is on a foreign tour. He has gone to other countries as well. Now he is in Qatar after a visit to Oman, and this is to mediate between Iran and the United States on their 2015 nuclear deal. Syed Ali Zia, Jaffery research associate from the CSSPR, joins us online. Thank you very much, Ali, to have joined us. Ali, what do you make of the JCPOA, the current status of the JCPOA, the 8th round of these talks, and of course the visits of the Iranian foreign minister to the different countries in order to make them understand Iran's point of view?
Thank you for having me on the show, Omar. I think it's a very important question, especially at this time. Despite the fact that all the parties are saying that progress has been made in the JCPOA and especially in the 8th round of talks, I think the statements coming out of the US do not augur well. The State Department spokesman Ned Price has said that Iran is dragging its feet and Iran is, gunning for nuclear escalation. So when talks are happening, statements like this are not good news. Iran wants the US to come back to the original 2015 deal because it wants to, push the US to, do away with those sanctions which were imposed, especially on the oil exports. So this is a tricky situation. I'm not optimistic about them, about both these countries returning to the JCPOA as it was agreed to in 2015. I say this because the difference is very stark. One party wants one thing and the other party wants a strikingly different thing. And in this context,
when you
I think
say
Iran
one party
is
needs one thing and the other party needs a totally different thing, isn't this more of or less the fact that Iran wants all the sanctions completely lifted that the US has imposed on it, whereas the US says, all right, we lift a couple of sanctions, but we are not going to lift all of the sanctions? Is that the thorny point, or there are some other points of contention as well?
I think this is a thorny point, but the fact is, let's be very frank. Iran did not leave the JCPOA. It was the US who left the JCPOA. Iran
Of
was
course.
fully compliant with the terms of the JCPOA. So Iran now has the grievances to be firm. It has the backing of the Ayatollah, the Grand Ayatollah, who was even otherwise not willing to crack this deal with the US in 2015. So what the US has done is that it has strengthened the hands of the hardliners in Iran who were already not in favor of this deal, and even despite all that, Iran is trying to go back to the old and new mediators in Qatar and Oman, because since for the past 1 year or so, Iran has been checking notes with Qatar, who has already decided to play a lead role in bringing the two countries together ever since it has come out of the blockade that was imposed on it in 2017. So this is something that I think is noteworthy, because Iran is trying to signal to the world that it is ready to go the extra mile in giving JCPOA another chance. But I think statements like the ones made by Net Price and by other people who have also said that the window for returning to JCPOA is shrinking by the minute and by the day. So this is something that I am not does not make me hopeful at all, despite the statements that are showing signs of improvement and of progress. I don't see tangible progress being made so far.
Now, Ali, despite this lack of tangible progress, as you yourself enunciate, don't you feel these regional alliances that Iran is trying to now strengthen, whether it be with Oman, whether it be with Qatar, whether it be with other regional countries, might play a role in case, I'm just saying in cases, that these talks on the JCPOA do not work out?
I think if the talks do not work out, then Iran is obviously trying to hedge its bets, in the sense that Iran is also improving its relations precipitously with China, who happens to be the biggest foe of the United States. So Iran, improving its ties with Qatar, with Oman, because in both these instances, the foreign minister of Iran also talked about the need for recalibrating bilateral relations with Doha and Oman. So this is something that, yes, if talks were to fail, and even if they don't fail, Iran is improving its regional position by conducting diplomacy, and this also is related with how the relatively new president Ibrahim Raisi wants to, assert himself as an astute diplomat in the region, and this is something we need to look into. There could be different motivations for Doha and for its partners in playing the go-between in this conflagration. Like for instance, Saudi Arabia may want the US to revive the JCPOA, but then pull the plug on Iran when it comes to ballistic missile, developments and all other things, because that is what Saudi Arabia and its allies and partners are worried about when it comes to Iran.
All right, Ali, also in all of this scenario of bilateral relations and regional relations comes the issue of Yemen as well. And this is also something that has been discussed with Oman. Do you feel that the regional countries with whom Iran is trying to forge a more stable relationship could also play a role somehow, somewhere in neutralizing this current crisis in Yemen?
Well, Iran also in those meetings also said that ostensibly framed its policy in Yemen by saying that this is for the Yemenis to decide. It's a fight between the Yemenis, and it is for the Yemenis to sort their matters out. So we need to look. So the Yemen crisis is not now as intense as it was before. So I think that issue may not be that big of a factor in this entire equation. But yes, things could go, because the relations between the Biden-led US and Saudi Arabia are not as robust, especially in the defense domain, as they were between the Trump-led US and Riyadh. If you recall, the first foreign visit that Trump conducted was to attend the Riyadh summit, where he warned Iran and threatened Iran just weeks before the blockade of Qatar. So we need to keep these things in context while we discuss the current forays in the Middle East.
All right. Speaking of forays as well, there are talks going on between the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Iran as well. There have been 4 rounds of direct talks hosted by Iraq. There is going to be a 5th round that is expected soon. So some kind of leeway is happening as far as the ties between the two countries are concerned to thwart out the issues that exist. Despite that, and in the whole context of the JCPOA, do you feel that Iran could strengthen itself one way or the other, irrespective of JCPOA, regionally and internationally?
Well, Iran was on a firmer wicket in the Middle East, in spite of all that was and is happening. So Iran, I think, has got nothing to lose. It obviously has, navigated many a trouble when it comes to sanctions and when it comes to how it operates in the Middle East. Its network of proxy warriors is very strong, and it has enabled it to improve its position in the Middle East. And this is one of the very significant regional threats that Iran for the region, and Iran is one of the agents that has caused this threat to further proliferate and further mar the stability in the Middle East. So Iran obviously would get back to its old ways, and it would have a pretext. The pretext would be that it was the US who broke this, who walked away from this agreement, despite the fact that we were fully compliant, and that compliance was ratified by the IAEA, which happened to be the watchdog. And Iran has, there are 2 things that Iran says when it talks about it's not being in favor of developing nuclear weapons. One is that it takes you back to the edict by Imam Khomeini, that nuclear weapons are un-Islamic, and the other thing is that it tells the world that we are a party and a signatory to the NPT. So Iran has already agreed to not develop nuclear weapons. So Iran, in this scenario, has nothing to lose.
Then Ali, comes the very logical question: why the apprehension? Why this delay by the US? If, as you yourself say, that Iran complies by the NPT, that also Iran does not want to develop these nuclear weapons, and at the same time it wants these talks to succeed. What is hampering the United States? Isn't it the United States? Wasn't this one of the pledges of Joe Biden as well, while he was going forward for his candidacy as President of the United States, that he will bring back the US and, of course, reinvigorate the JCPOA?
I always say this: Iran-US relations, defy what Lord Palmerston said about the inconsistency of friendships and enmities when it comes to international relations. So ever since the Iranian Revolution, Washington and Tehran have been on a collision course, and they hate each other to the hilt. So Iran was the JCPOA was made a victim of non-nuclear things. Because Iran was rightly or wrongly was seen as the biggest impediment to US political and strategic goals in the Middle East. It was a threat to US allies in Iran, in Israel and Saudi Arabia, and this is why Trump did this. Now, when a lot of damage had been done, it was very difficult, and I wrote about this in one of the international publications that I did when Biden came into power. that it would be now very difficult for Biden to go back to the JCPOA because, as I said earlier, hardliners in Iran have been strengthened, and they think that the US satanic America is back to its old tricks. And they also say that satanic America was never sincere in going ahead with this agreement. So I think there's a lot of animosity that stops the US and Iran from sincerely talking about going back to the deal. There's no flexibility. So if flexibility is not added to the mix, I think the revival would be a far shot. Um, this is what I this is how I read the situation.
Ali, finally, looking at the whole entire concept of regional hegemony or global power tugging that is going on as we speak, and of course the JCPOA, that is one of the very important factors as we speak as far as global nuclearization is concerned. What are your prospects if I were to ask you today, how optimistic or not are you of this JCPOA to kind of attain some kind of a credibility in the days and months to come? What would be your reply?
Okay, now this is a very good question, but I would answer it a bit differently. I think the JCPOA is a classic example of how big powers like the US, have used and abused non-proliferation goals and policies to their advantage. I say this because when the JCPOA was being eviscerated, the US was negotiating or trying to negotiate with North Korea. So that must have given Iran a food for thought, in the sense that Iran would have been thinking that if a very erratic and a very reclusive leader in Jong Un was being pampered by the US, so to speak, at that very moment, the Iranian mullahs were being targeted like anything because they did not have nuclear weapons. And so this hypocrisy or this dichotomy is and was not a good news for the future prospect of nuclear proliferation. So we need to look at the entire thing in that very context. It is the optics that are not good when you break an agreement or a deal, however you may want to put it, with a compliant state for non-nuclear reasons, and then at the same time you are negotiating with a nuclear armed state. That gives all the wrong signals to a state that has so far detested from developing detested developing nuclear weapons. So going forward, the US needs to tailor its policy if it actually is committed to strengthening the non-proliferation regime.
All right, that's a very interesting perspective, and I'd hold on to it. Thank you very much, Syed Ali Zia Jaffery, Sub-Research Associate with the CSSPR, to have joined us and to have talked to us about Iran's perspective in the whole context of the JCPOA and the bridging and or the strengthening of relations that it's trying to go towards as far as different other countries in the region is concerned. Let's hope that the optics or the absence of those maybe lead to some kind of a rethinking of policies both from the Western side and the Iranian side, and they come to some kind of a middle ground as far as the JCPOA is concerned. The whole world is watching. I hope the parties concerned, especially the West, are also as concerned as we are. Let's come to our last two stories, ladies and gentlemen. The first is about Rawalpindi, climate change, rainwater, and how it has been decided by the Pindi authority to have rainwater harvesting projects and underground water tanks that are to be built in 5 major parks. This has been decided by the Parks and Horticulture Authority. It has developed a mega rainwater harvesting storage project in 5 major parks across Rawalpindi city that include Allama Iqbal Park, Rawal Park, Potohar Park, Liaquat Park and Commercial Markets Children's Park. And these 5 underground water parks, of course, have been designed under the Annual Development Program scheme. This is going to lead to not only storing the water when it rains, but also harvesting that water for the needs of these very gardens. Instead of using the same water from other sources, this source will be the one that will keep reinvigorating these parks over the years and also give a water supply to all the plants and trees that are there. A very good initiative in the whole wake of climate change and how Pakistan is one of the most vulnerable countries as far as the effects of climate change are concerned. And our last story, ladies and gentlemen, is New Jersey. In the United States, that has passed a resolution to condemn the 1984 Sikh genocide in India. This resolution will also be presented to the US President Joe Biden, highlighting the century-old legacy and the importance of the Sikh community contributions to the American economy. This is a very important step in that direction to make the Sikh perspective understood by the West, and how India also, in the whole context of how India is treating its minorities even now under the BJP regime. It is pertinent that past, graves be dug and the past policies of India also be revisited. With that, of course, we end today's newsroom. But before we end it, we have a little rap song by this boy from Tando, Allahyar. His name is Khalid Jarwar. And of course, as rap, as far as other forms of music are also concerned, are taking more or less center stage within the youth of Pakistan. This young boy from Tando, Allahyar, has come up with this music video and this rap song that is slowly and steadily gaining popularity. We'll leave you with that, but in the meantime, before I go, I would again request you to kindly follow the SOPs and get your vaccinations at the earliest. Allah Hafiz, we'll see you tomorrow. Watch the song.
आयु अंजाम हिते मंदिरा रमा पीर हिते मैंगो सिटी मोश दरिया वतायो फकीर जिदरगा बहेते हिते जा माण्हू अन तबियत जा सादा ऐं दिल जा अमीर हिते मंसिया पार कहीं कच्चो अकेलो चंबड़ जो नाको ऐं फैस फूड एडीअ जो भलो बड़ा हिते खोड़ ईअं मकया बया शाही बाज़ार जी गलियुनि जी सोड़ हिते चिंची हलंदो आ कनन में रुगो चिंची जो गोड़ हिते चिंची हलंदो आ कनन में रुगो चिंची जो गोड़ Your